The tin can opened with a dull pop, and Jacob Brennan stared down at the cold beans for the 2,555th time in 7 years, his stomach turning at the sight of congealed fat floating on top like scum on a still pond. He had stopped counting the days somewhere around year 3, but the number of cans remained etched in his memory, a monument to loneliness that grew taller with each passing season on his ranch outside Abilene, Kansas, where the prairie grass stretched endlessly toward a horizon that promised nothing but more of the same emptiness that had defined his life since Sarah died giving birth to their stillborn daughter in the winter of 1873. The year was now 1880, and Jacob had turned 32 last month without celebration or acknowledgement, eating his beans straight from the can while standing at the kitchen window of the ranch house he had built with his own hands back, when hope still lived in his chest like a warm fire. The kitchen had grown cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature, though he rarely bothered to light the stove anymore except to boil coffee, and even that tasted like ash in his mouth most mornings when he forced himself to drink it before heading out to tend the cattle that provided his meager living. The ranch itself sprawled across 200 acres of decent grazing land, with a creek that ran year-round and enough shelter in the rolling hills to protect the herd during the brutal Kansas winters that could kill a man as easily as they killed cattle if he was not careful. Jacob had 50 head now, down from the 80 he had maintained when Sarah was alive, and the future seemed full of possibilities instead of this grinding routine of survival that had worn grooves into his soul as deep as the wagon ruts on the trail into town. He ate the beans with a bent spoon, not tasting them, his mind wandering to the work that awaited him outside where a fence needed mending on the eastern boundary, and 3 calves required branding before the week ended. The silence in the house pressed against his eardrums like physical weight, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock that Sarah had brought from her family home in St. Louis, the one item in the entire house that he kept wound and running because stopping it felt like killing her all over again. When he finished eating, Jacob rinsed the spoon under the pump at the sink and left the empty can on the counter beside the dozens of others that accumulated, until he finally gathered the motivation to haul them out to the trash pile behind the barn. He pulled on his worn leather vest, settled his hat on his head, and stepped out into the September morning where the sun was just beginning to burn off the mist that clung to the low places in the land. The day passed like all the others before it, filled with the physical labor that kept his body strong even as his spirit withered. And when evening came he returned to the house covered in dust and sweat, stripped down at the pump to wash himself in the cold water that made his skin prickle, then went inside to open another can of beans that he ate standing at the same window, looking out at the same view, feeling the same crushing weight of solitude that had become as familiar as breathing. But the next morning brought something different, a sound that Jacob had not heard in so long that at first he thought he was imagining it, the distant rumble of wagon wheels coming up the long drive from the main road that connected his isolated ranch to the town of Abilene 6 miles to the east. He straightened from the water trough where he had been checking the level, shading his eyes against the rising sun to watch a covered wagon pulled by 2 bay horses making its way toward his property with steady determination. Jacob felt a flutter of something in his chest that might have been curiosity or might have been anxiety, his hand instinctively moving to check that his revolver sat secure in its holster, even though visitors were rarely dangerous out here, mostly just neighbors needing help or merchants who had lost their way on the confusing network of ranch roads that crisscrossed the prairie like veins under skin. As the wagon drew closer, he could make out a single figure on the driver's bench, someone slight and upright who handled the reins with competent ease. The wagon rolled to a stop 20 feet from where he stood, and Jacob felt his breath catch in his throat when the driver pushed back the bonnet that had shaded her face, revealing a woman perhaps 25 years old with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and green eyes that assessed him with frank directness as she set the brake and wrapped the reins around the handle. "This the Brennan Ranch?" Her voice carried clearly across the space between them, neither soft nor harsh, just matter-of-fact in a way that suggested she was accustomed to asking questions and expecting answers. "It is," Jacob replied, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance, suddenly aware of how he must look after days without a proper shave and wearing clothes that had seen better years. "Jacob Brennan, can I help you with something?" The woman climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease, landing lightly on her feet and brushing dust from her simple brown traveling dress that had clearly endured many miles on the road. "My name is Catherine Mercer. I am looking for work as a housekeeper and cook. The man at the mercantile in town mentioned you might have need of such services." Jacob felt his face flush hot with embarrassment, imagining old Henry Patterson spreading gossip about the widower who lived on cold beans and let his house fall into disrepair, and his first instinct was to send this woman away immediately, because the thought of having another person in the house where Sarah had lived and died felt like a betrayal of memory that he could not stomach. But something in Catherine Mercer's steady gaze stopped the refusal before it reached his lips, some quality of quiet strength that reminded him of his late wife, even though the two women looked nothing alike. "I do not have much need for a housekeeper," he said, the words coming out more defensive than he intended. "I manage well enough on my own." Catherine's eyebrow lifted slightly, and her gaze moved past him to the house visible behind him, taking in details that Jacob suddenly saw through her eyes. The sagging porch rail that he had been meaning to fix for 2 years, the windows that had not been properly cleaned since before Sarah died, the general air of neglect that hung over the place like a fog. When her eyes returned to his face, he saw no judgment there, only a calm assessment that somehow felt worse than criticism would have been. "I see," she said, and those 2 words contained volumes of meaning that made Jacob want to defend himself further, but she continued before he could speak. "I will be honest with you, Mr. Brennan. I have been traveling for 3 weeks looking for employment, and my funds are nearly exhausted. I am a hard worker, I cook well, and I keep a clean house. I would ask only for room and board and a small wage of $10 per month. If you find after 1 week that you do not require my services, I will move on without complaint." Jacob opened his mouth to refuse, to send her back to town where surely someone else would hire a woman with her evident capabilities, but what came out instead surprised him. 1 week trial. "There is a small room off the kitchen that you can use. I eat simple food and do not require fancy cooking." Something that might have been relief flickered across Catherine's face so quickly that he almost missed it, and she nodded once, crisp and businesslike. "That is more than fair. Should I stable the horses, or will you direct me where to place them?" "I will handle the horses," Jacob said, grateful for the familiar task that gave him something to do with his hands that suddenly felt awkward and too large. "You can take your things inside. The door is not locked." He watched from the corner of his eye as Catherine gathered a worn carpet bag and a wooden trunk from the back of the wagon, carrying them with the same capable efficiency she had displayed in everything else. And he wondered what circumstances had put a woman alone on the road looking for work on isolated ranches. It was not his business to ask, he told himself firmly as he led her horses toward the barn, and he would maintain a proper employer and employee relationship that kept personal questions and personal feelings firmly locked away where they belonged. By the time Jacob had unhitched the horses, rubbed them down, and given them feed and water in 2 of his empty stalls, the sun had climbed higher, and his stomach reminded him that he had not yet eaten breakfast. He approached the house with reluctance, not sure what he would find inside, and when he pushed open the kitchen door, the smell hit him first, the rich aroma of coffee brewing on the stove, actual coffee that smelled like it was supposed to smell instead of the bitter brew he usually choked down. Catherine stood at the stove with her back to him, her dress protected by an apron she must have found in one of the drawers, and she turned at the sound of his entrance with a slight smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I found eggs in the henhouse and bacon in the cold cellar. I hope you do not mind that I took the liberty." Jacob stared at the table where 2 plates sat, each bearing 3 eggs fried golden, thick slices of bacon that sizzled with residual heat, and bread that she must have brought with her because he had not baked in years. His throat tightened with an emotion he could not name, something that felt dangerously close to grief, mixed with a longing he had thought dead and buried. "That is fine," he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "You did not need to cook for me. I usually just eat something quick." "Cold beans from a can," Catherine said, and it was not a question. She gestured to the pile of empty tins he had left accumulating on the counter, now stacked neatly beside the door, presumably to be taken out to the trash. "Please sit, Mr. Brennan. The food will get cold if we delay." Jacob sat because he could not think of a good reason to refuse, and when Catherine placed the plate before him and then took her own seat across the table, he picked up his fork with fingers that felt clumsy and uncertain. The first bite of egg melted on his tongue with a richness that made his eyes sting, and he had to look down at his plate to hide the unexpected surge of feeling that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. They ate in silence, but it was not the oppressive silence that usually filled the house. Instead, something almost comfortable in the quiet sounds of cutlery against plates, and the soft morning light streaming through windows that Catherine had apparently already cleaned, because he could see through them more clearly than he had in years. When they finished, Jacob stood to take his plate to the sink, but Catherine waved him away with a gesture that brooked no argument. "You have work to do outside, I am sure. I will handle the kitchen." Jacob fled. There was no other word for it, escaping to the familiar territory of the barn and the cattle and the endless tasks that filled his days with purpose that required no emotional investment. But throughout the morning, as he worked on the fence that needed mending, his mind kept drifting back to the warm kitchen, and the smell of real cooking and the way Catherine had moved through the space like she belonged there, and he felt an uncomfortable mixture of gratitude and resentment that made him work harder to drive the confusing feelings away. When noon came and his stomach told him it was time to eat, Jacob considered staying out on the range and just skipping the midday meal the way he usually did, but his feet carried him back to the house almost against his will. Catherine had left food on the table covered with a cloth, cold chicken and fresh bread and pickled vegetables that must have come from her own supplies, and a note in neat handwriting that said she had gone into one of the other rooms to begin cleaning, and he should help himself. Jacob ate standing at the counter, then went back outside quickly before she could reappear and force him into conversation that he did not want to have. The afternoon passed in a blur of physical labor that left him exhausted by the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, and when he finally trudged back to the house as twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, he found the kitchen transformed. Every surface gleamed with cleanliness, the windows sparkled, the floor had been swept and scrubbed, and the pile of empty bean cans had disappeared entirely. The table was set for 2 again, and something bubbled on the stove that filled the air with a rich, savory smell that made his mouth water despite his determination to remain unmoved by Catherine's presence. She appeared from the direction of the bedrooms, still wearing her apron and looking slightly flushed from what must have been hours of hard work. "I hope you do not mind, but I took the liberty of airing out the other rooms. The house needed it badly." Jacob felt a spike of anger that she would presume to enter the bedroom he had shared with Sarah, but when he looked at Catherine's face, he saw only the same calm competence with no hint of judgment or pity, and the anger died as quickly as it had risen. "That is fine. It is what I hired you for." "Actually, you hired me on a trial basis," Catherine corrected gently, ladling stew into bowls that she placed on the table. And I intend to prove my worth. Please sit." This time Jacob sat without argument, and when he tasted the stew, rich with beef and vegetables and herbs that created flavors he had almost forgotten existed, something inside his chest cracked open just slightly. They ate in silence again, but Catherine watched him with those steady green eyes, and finally she spoke into the quiet that had stretched between them. "How long has it been since you had a proper meal, Mr. Brennan?" Jacob set down his spoon carefully, considering how to answer, and decided on the truth, because lying seemed like too much effort. 7 years, give or take. My wife died in childbirth, and I never learned to cook like she did. Beans from a can were easier. Catherine nodded as if he had confirmed something she already suspected. "And you have been punishing yourself ever since, eating cold food in a cold house, letting everything fall into disrepair, including yourself." The observation was so accurate that Jacob felt exposed and vulnerable in a way he had not experienced since Sarah's death, and his first instinct was to lash out in anger that would drive this perceptive woman away and allow him to return to his comfortable misery. But looking at Catherine's face, he saw only gentle understanding, no pity or condescension, and instead of anger, what rose in his throat was something that felt dangerously like a sob. "She was everything," he said, the words forcing themselves out against his will. "When she died, the light went out. I did not see any point in making the house warm again when she would not be there to share it." "I understand," Catherine said quietly, and something in her tone made Jacob believe that she truly did understand, that she carried her own losses that had shaped her into the woman sitting across from him. "But you are still alive, Mr. Brennan, and life insists on continuing whether we will it or not." They finished the meal in silence, and afterward Jacob helped Catherine clear the table despite her protests, needing something to do with his hands while his emotions settled back into their usual numb state. When the kitchen was clean, Catherine bid him good night and disappeared into the small room off the kitchen, closing the door with a soft click that felt final. Jacob stood alone in the transformed kitchen for a long moment, then climbed the stairs to his bedroom where Catherine had indeed aired everything out, changing sheets that he had not bothered to wash in months and opening windows that let in fresh prairie air that smelled of grass and distant rain. He lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in 7 years, he did not dream of Sarah dying but instead of green eyes, and the smell of cooking that made the house feel alive again. The week of the trial period passed with surprising speed, each day falling into a rhythm that began with breakfast at the kitchen table and ended with dinner in the same location, the 2 meals bracketing the long hours of work that kept Jacob outside and Catherine inside, transforming the neglected house into something that resembled a home again. She cleaned every room with thorough determination, washed curtains and bedding, swept away cobwebs and dust, and even tackled the porch, repairing the sagging rail with competence that surprised Jacob when he came in one evening to find her wielding a hammer with practiced ease. "My father was a carpenter," she explained when she caught him watching. "He taught me basic repairs before he died." Jacob wanted to ask about her father, about the losses that had shaped her life the way Sarah's death had shaped his, but the words stuck in his throat and the moment passed. Instead, he found himself watching Catherine more closely, noticing small things like the way she hummed softly while she worked, old hymns that his mother had sung when he was a child, and how she always set the table with care even though it was just the 2 of them, as if presentation mattered even in isolation. On the 7th day, Jacob knew he could not let Catherine leave even though the thought of her staying permanently filled him with an anxiety that bordered on panic. She had made no mention of the trial period ending, had simply continued her work with the same steady dedication. But at dinner that evening, he forced himself to speak before his cowardice could stop him. "I would like you to stay on, permanently, if you are willing." Catherine looked up from her plate, and something that might have been relief or might have been satisfaction flickered across her face. "I would be willing, Mr. Brennan. I find the work satisfactory and the arrangement agreeable." "Jacob," he said impulsively. "You should call me Jacob. Mr. Brennan sounds too formal when we are eating meals together every day." A small smile touched Catherine's lips, transforming her face into something almost beautiful. "Very well, Jacob, and you should call me Catherine." The formal acknowledgement of their new relationship felt significant in ways Jacob could not quite articulate, as if they had crossed some invisible boundary that changed the nature of their interactions. Over the following weeks, he found himself spending more time in the house, coming inside for midday meals instead of skipping them, lingering over coffee in the evenings while Catherine worked on mending or other household tasks. And they began to talk in fits and starts about inconsequential things that gradually became more personal. Jacob learned that Catherine had been married briefly to a man who died in a farming accident 3 years earlier, leaving her with debts that forced her to sell their small homestead in Missouri and strike out on her own looking for work. She had no family left, both parents dead and her only brother killed in the war, and she spoke of her losses with the same quiet acceptance that Jacob recognized in himself. The understanding that grief was a permanent companion that you learned to accommodate rather than overcome. Catherine learned in turn that Jacob had come to Kansas with Sarah in 1872, drawn by cheap land and the promise of building something lasting, and that the first years had been good despite the hardships inherent in ranch life. Sarah had been strong and capable, partners in every sense during the difficult work of establishing the ranch, and her death had shattered Jacob so completely that he had simply stopped living in any meaningful sense, going through the motions of survival without purpose or joy. As October arrived and the weather began to turn toward the cold that would define the coming winter, Jacob found himself thinking about Catherine at odd moments during his work, wondering what she was doing in the house, looking forward to meals with an anticipation that had nothing to do with hunger for food. He caught himself watching her during dinner, noticing the way lamplight turned her auburn hair to copper, and how her hands moved with unconscious grace when she poured coffee or passed him bread. The realization that he was developing feelings for Catherine hit him one evening in mid-October, when he came inside to find her standing at the stove stirring something that smelled of apples and cinnamon, and the sight of her in the warm kitchen filled him with a longing so intense it almost brought him to his knees. He stood frozen in the doorway, understanding that at some point during the past 6 weeks, Catherine had stopped being merely his housekeeper and had become essential to his existence in ways that terrified him, because it meant risking the kind of devastating loss he had sworn never to experience again. Catherine turned and caught him staring, and something in his expression must have revealed his thoughts because color rose in her cheeks and her eyes widened slightly. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings, and then Jacob did something he had not done since Sarah died. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and pulled Catherine into his arms, burying his face in her hair that smelled of soap and cinnamon and something uniquely her. "I cannot lose you," he said against her hair, his voice breaking on the words. "I know I have no right to feel this way. I know you came here for employment and not for this, but I cannot help it. You made the kitchen warm again. You made me warm again." Catherine's arms came up around his waist, holding him with surprising strength, and when she pulled back enough to look up into his face, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "You have every right to feel whatever you feel, Jacob, and you are not alone in those feelings. I did not come here looking for this, but I found it anyway, and I do not want to leave." Jacob kissed her then, a tentative press of lips that quickly deepened into something fierce and desperate. 7 years of loneliness and longing pouring out in the connection of their mouths and the tight embrace of their bodies. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against Catherine's and felt something that had been frozen in his chest for so long finally begin to thaw. "I loved Sarah," he said, needing her to understand. "I will always love her memory, but she is gone and you are here, and I think I could love you too if you give me the chance." "I loved Thomas," Catherine replied, her hands coming up to frame his face with gentle pressure. "And I will carry that love always. But we are both still alive, Jacob, and we deserve to be happy again if we can find the courage to reach for it." They stood holding each other in the warm kitchen while the apple pie Catherine had been making filled the air with sweetness. And outside the October wind picked up, carrying the first hints of the winter that would soon descend on the Kansas prairie. But inside, the fire in the stove burned bright, and for the first time in 7 years, Jacob felt genuinely warm all the way through to his bones. The transition from employer and employee to something more happened gradually over the following weeks, a natural progression that felt inevitable in retrospect. Jacob moved slowly, conscious of propriety and Catherine's reputation, even though they lived alone on an isolated ranch where no one would know or care about the exact nature of their relationship. They continued to maintain separate bedrooms, but the emotional intimacy between them grew with each shared meal, and each evening spent talking by the fire that Catherine insisted on keeping lit in the main room that had stood cold and unused for years. November brought the first hard freeze and snow that dusted the prairie with white, and Jacob spent long days ensuring the cattle had adequate shelter and feed to survive the coming winter. Catherine proved her worth again by helping with the outdoor work when needed, bundling up in a heavy coat that had belonged to Sarah, and that Jacob had found himself able to offer without the sharp stab of grief that would have accompanied the gesture a few months earlier. She handled cattle with surprising competence, explaining that she had helped Thomas with their small herd in Missouri, and Jacob found himself grateful for her partnership in ways that went beyond the emotional. As the days shortened and the cold deepened, Jacob and Catherine spent more time together in the evenings, sitting close by the fire while she sewed or knitted and he repaired tack or whittled. And they talked about everything and nothing, building the foundation of understanding that transforms attraction into something deeper and more lasting. Jacob told her about his childhood in Ohio, about the parents he had lost to fever when he was 20, about the dreams that had brought him west seeking a fresh start. Catherine shared her own stories, painting pictures of a girlhood spent in a small Missouri town, of a father who had taught her to value honest work and self-reliance, of a brief marriage that had been happy despite its tragic end. On Thanksgiving, Catherine cooked a feast that would have been extravagant for 2 people, and when Jacob protested the waste, she smiled and said that gratitude required celebration even in modest circumstances. They ate turkey and stuffing and potatoes and pie, and afterward Jacob pulled Catherine into his lap in front of the fire and kissed her until they were both breathless with wanting. But he still did not push for more because he needed to do this right, needed to honor what was growing between them with the respect it deserved. "Marry me," he said one evening in early December when the snow was falling outside in thick white flakes that turned the world into a hushed wonderland. They sat together on the sofa Catherine had uncovered and cleaned, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest, and the words emerged without planning or preamble. "I know it has only been 3 months, I know it is fast, but I am certain. I want you in my life permanently, not as my housekeeper but as my wife." Catherine tilted her head back to look at him, and in the firelight, her eyes glowed with an emotion that made Jacob's heart pound against his ribs. "Yes," she said simply. "I will marry you, Jacob Brennan. I am certain too." They married in Abilene 2 weeks before Christmas, a simple ceremony at the church with the minister and his wife as witnesses. And Catherine wore a dress of deep blue that Jacob bought for her at the mercantile along with a ring that cost him more than he should have spent, but felt worth every penny when he slid it onto her finger. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed Catherine with a tenderness that held all the hope and fear and desperate love that filled his chest to bursting. The wedding night was everything Jacob had hoped and feared, a coming together that was both awkward and perfect, marked by gentleness and passion in equal measure. Catherine came to him without shyness or hesitation, and when they finally lay tangled together in the bed that Jacob had once shared with Sarah, he felt no guilt or sense of betrayal, only profound gratitude that life had given him this second chance at happiness that he had never expected to find. Winter settled over the ranch with serious intent, and Jacob spent January and February working hard to keep the cattle alive through brutal cold snaps and blizzards that turned the prairie into a white wasteland where a man could lose himself and freeze to death within yards of his own barn. Catherine proved herself invaluable during those hard months, helping with the outside work when needed, but also maintaining the inside of the house as a warm refuge where Jacob could retreat to thaw frozen fingers and toes, where hot food and warmer embraces restored his strength and will to face the next day's challenges. They settled into married life with surprising ease, as if they had been together for years instead of months, and Jacob marveled at how different this relationship felt from his marriage to Sarah, even though he loved both women deeply. With Sarah, everything had been intense and passionate, a young love that burned bright and hot, while what he shared with Catherine was steadier and calmer, a mature affection built on mutual respect and understanding of life's hardships that created a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. Spring arrived in late March with the dramatic suddenness that characterized Kansas weather, one day frozen solid, and the next showing hints of green as the prairie began its annual resurrection. Jacob spent long days checking the herd and finding that his careful management through the winter had paid off with minimal losses, and he felt a satisfaction that had been absent for years, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival, because now he had someone to build a future with instead of just enduring an endless present. In May, Catherine told him she was pregnant. The news delivered one evening after dinner with a mixture of joy and apprehension because they both understood the risks that childbirth carried, especially on an isolated ranch where medical help was hours away at best. Jacob felt fear grip his heart with icy fingers, memories of Sarah's death flooding back with vivid intensity, but Catherine took his face in her hands and made him look at her. "I am not Sarah," she said firmly. "Every pregnancy is different, every woman's experience is unique. You cannot let fear of the past steal joy from the present." Jacob tried to believe her, tried to embrace the excitement of impending parenthood. But as Catherine's belly swelled through the summer months, the fear grew alongside it, until he could barely sleep at night for worrying about all the things that could go wrong. He became overprotective to the point where Catherine finally snapped at him in August, telling him that she was pregnant, not made of glass, and if he did not stop hovering, she would hit him with the cast iron skillet. The baby came in early January of 1882, during a cold snap that had Jacob terrified they would not be able to get to town for the doctor. But Catherine's labor progressed so quickly that there was no time for anything except Jacob's fumbling assistance as his wife brought their child into the world with remarkable efficiency considering it was her first. When the baby let out its first cry, strong and healthy and indignant at being forced from warm darkness into cold light, Jacob felt tears streaming down his face as he looked at the red, wrinkled face of his son. "Thomas Jacob," Catherine said, her voice exhausted but triumphant, "for both our first husbands, so neither of them is forgotten." Jacob could only nod, his throat too tight for speech, and when Catherine placed the baby in his arms, he understood that this was not a replacement for what he had lost, but something entirely new, a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. He sat on the edge of the bed holding his son while Catherine slept, and through the window, he could see the first light of dawn breaking over the prairie. painting the snow-covered land in shades of pink and gold that promised warmth even in the depths of winter. The years that followed were not without challenges because ranch life never was, but they were good years in ways that Jacob had forgotten were possible. Thomas grew into a sturdy toddler with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and in 1884, Catherine gave birth to twin daughters that they named Sarah and Emma, honoring the past while embracing the present. The house that had once stood cold and empty filled with the noise and chaos of children, with laughter and crying, and the thousand small dramas that defined family life. Jacob expanded the herd and built a new barn with help from neighbors who had slowly become friends, as he emerged from the isolation that had defined his years alone. Catherine established a garden that provided fresh vegetables through the summer and canning that lasted through the winter, and she became known in the area for her cooking, often providing meals for new families settling in the region who needed help getting established. On a warm evening in June of 1887, Jacob sat on the porch that he had finally repaired properly, watching the sun set over his land while Catherine sat beside him in the rocking chair he had built for her, and their children played in the yard, Thomas chasing his sisters in a game that involved much shrieking and laughter. Inside the house, Jacob could see through the windows to the kitchen where Catherine had left bread rising for tomorrow's breakfast, and he could smell the faint scent of the stew that was their dinner, and he felt a contentment so profound, it almost frightened him with its intensity. "What are you thinking about?" Catherine asked, reaching over to take his hand, her fingers lacing through his with the easy familiarity of years together. "I am thinking about cold beans," Jacob said, and when Catherine laughed, the sound warmed him more than any fire ever could. "I am thinking about 7 years of cold beans and a cold house and a cold life, and how close I came to staying frozen forever. And then you arrived and made everything warm again." Catherine squeezed his hand, her eyes soft with understanding and love. "We both arrived at the right time. You needed someone to remind you that life continues, and I needed someone to build a new life with. We saved each other, Jacob." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head while their children played and the evening light turned the prairie golden. And Jacob understood that this was what happiness looked like, not the absence of grief or loss, but the presence of love strong enough to coexist with those memories, creating something new without erasing what came before. The kitchen inside was warm, the house was full of life, and the man who had once eaten cold beans alone every night for 7 long years now sat surrounded by the family he had never expected to have, grateful beyond measure for the woman who had arrived in a dusty wagon and changed everything simply by being willing to stay. The children grew and the years passed, bringing the inevitable mixture of joy and sorrow that defined human existence. But through it all, Jacob and Catherine faced each challenge together with the strength that came from a partnership built on mutual respect and deep love. Thomas proved himself a natural rancher, taking over more of the work as Jacob aged, while Sarah showed a talent for numbers that had her managing the ranch accounts by the time she was 15. Emma developed her mother's skill in the kitchen and her father's way with horses, and became known throughout the county for her ability to gentle even the most difficult animals. In 1895, when Jacob turned 47 and Catherine 40, they celebrated their 13th wedding anniversary with a party that filled the house and yard with neighbors and friends who had become like family over the years. Jacob stood in the warm kitchen that had once been so cold and empty, watching Catherine move through the crowd with easy grace, and he marveled again at the twist of fate that had brought her to his isolated ranch on that September morning so long ago. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children had been sent to bed, Jacob and Catherine sat together on the porch in the comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer needed words to communicate. The prairie stretched away in all directions, dark under a sky brilliant with stars, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonely song to the moon. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked quietly. "Answering that job posting, coming out here to work for a stranger on an isolated ranch." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Not for a single second. This life we have built together, this family, this home, it is everything I could have hoped for and more than I dared to dream. You gave me a place to belong when I had nowhere else to go, and I gave you a reason to live again. That seems like a fair exchange." "More than fair," Jacob said, pulling her close. "You gave me everything." They sat together watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, two people who had survived loss and loneliness to find each other at exactly the right moment. And inside the house, the kitchen stood ready for tomorrow's breakfast, warm and welcoming, a testament to the power of love to transform cold emptiness into abundant life. The man who had once eaten cold beans alone every night had learned to live again, and the woman who had arrived in a dusty wagon had found the home she had been seeking. Together they had created something lasting and good, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone, in the children they raised and the land they tended, and the love that filled every corner of the house that had once stood cold and empty, but now blazed with the warmth of family and hope, and a future bright with promise.